It's a real pleasure and a real honour, and not at all irrelevant to the work that I do, to be here today. In part because I've just taken over to set up a new programme on digital and technology for development at the Institute of Development Studies in the UK. And in that programme, media for development is indeed one of the themes that we're looking at, trying to understand and explore how better evidence can be used to ground media for development, to demonstrate its contribution to the broader debates, and to, in a sense, defend it against those more accountancy-based approaches that may try and assess, as Oscar Wilde said, that count the price of everything but the value of nothing. So what I want to talk about today is essentially the problem with aid. I'm going to start off, and there's three things I want to talk about. I want to talk about the way aid currently works. I want to talk about the way the world works, which is a rather grandiose and ambitious statement. I'm going to try and do that in about 5 minutes. And then I'm going to try and talk about the way aid could work, or maybe the way aid should work. Let me start off by sharing a contrast which summarizes really the message that I want to talk about today, and which I think underpins the rethinking that needs to happen in aid. And these are two recent, very different stories from the broad field of digital and technology for development. The first story is from Uganda in 2013. And this is a map at the end of 2012 of just a few of the mobile-based health projects that were going on in the country at that time. And this is a real problem for the country. There were lots of projects that were being designed in a very top-down fashion. Many of them were being designed far from the country using expensive mobile technology advisors. They were being designed in New York, in California, in London, in Paris, in Geneva. There were many different suppliers and providers, and there was a complete lack of coordination and collaboration. And this proliferation of initiatives may be fine if you're talking about new applications for tweeting or for social media, which is quite generic. But we're talking about the health system of a country. And this led to enormous amounts of confusion within the health system. It led to wasted resources. It threw the system into disarray. And ultimately, because all of these applications had a community at the end of it that was the target, it left communities unable to engage with the sheer variety of things that were going on. And so in early 2013, the Ugandan government took an unprecedented step. They banned all digital health projects. They placed a moratorium, and they said, you need to get your act together, international community. There was a backlash from the international community, and ironically, one of the backlashes, one of the strands of that backlash, drew on notions of freedom of information. You can't control information, so let us be free to do what we want to, was one of the responses. But slowly, with the controls that the government put in, with a call for just greater coordination, greater collaboration, the system has become less irrational, less unpredictable. So the challenge underlying this story was really about how the international community could become more attuned and more sensitive to context. The second story is a rather more heartening example. Actually, does anyone know what this is or recognize this picture? Does anyone know what it means? A show of hands. Okay, if you don't. This is a picture of goats in Mogadishu in Somalia. And the numbers that are daubed onto the sides of the goats are the owner's mobile phone numbers. This is a system of identification. I'll explain how it works in a second, but it was originally used in the western part of the country, and people put mobile phones onto the ears of the goats as a system of identification. But unfortunately, ears proved removable without really harming the goats. Well, individual goats may disagree with this, but essentially it meant you could take the ears off and there was no way of then identifying the goats. So the process was adapted to use the hides. And this system of identification was used to prevent straying, to prevent theft of livestock in a country where animals are absolutely central to livelihoods. And what's fascinating is to see the emerging accounts that are coming up of how this has evolved. It's turned into a way of marketing one's services, be it milk or meat. The health of your goat, if your mobile phone number's on the side, means that someone can contact you, find out all kinds of things about what you're providing. And so it evolved into a bottom-up innovation and adaptation at the local level, into an approach that can really underpin and sustain livelihoods and incomes. And it's also become a way of sharing social capital and trust. If you have your mobile phone on your side of your goat, there's someone else that has their mobile phone on the side of their goat. It becomes a way of becoming part of a broader community, an indication of shared norms, if you like, all from 6 numbers painted on a goat hide. And I think if you want to try and compare this a little bit more formally, we can map them something like this. The mobile health crisis in Uganda in 2013 was abstract. It was expert-driven. It was top-down. It was highly engineered. It was based on the supply of technology, and that technology was pushed into communities. It really reinforced existing modes of the aid system. We will deliver to you. And ultimately, it was limiting national and local capacities. So the policy approach that underpinned this was around centralized control through project management. It was about clear upfront designs and goals. You set targets, you create contracts, you deliver, and penalties for not delivering. The irony of this is that although it's a very rational approach, on the ground it led to a completely irrational system. By contrast, the Somalia experience was about contextually specific changes. It was led by end users. It was much less about the top-down end of the system. It was much more about appropriate design to the context. It was highly iterative in nature. It went from putting it on the ears to the hides. It adapted according to context. And it was based on the needs of the farmers. It was much less about pushing technology and much more about seeing how communities could pull technology into being used. And I think that's a really important lesson for thinking about digital tomorrow. And I think instead of reinforcing existing approaches, it was much more about reshaping them. And ultimately, it was a much more empowering approach. Now, making this work was a more complex endeavor in some ways. It consisted of many different social, economic, and environmental goals to be realized. And it requires lots of different actors to kind of interact together in a kind of self-organized fashion. And if you're an international organization, you don't control any of those actors. So what this requires, if you're going to engage with this kind of process, is if you like, a high-level goal and a framework for linking to experiments, linking to innovation, linking to opportunity, and allowing ideal solutions to emerge over time. And I think it's interesting to reflect on where we think the sector is, if this is a spectrum, if you like, from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. Where do we think the sector is right now? And where do we think we want it to be? Now, I think that these contrasts actually illuminate a central challenge, not just in development, but in public policy as a whole. That many public bodies follow this side of the, that's not working, but they follow the left-hand side, even when it's clear that they're dealing with issues that are not amenable to such approaches. And this approach may not be appropriate, it may not be helpful, but it's often applied unthinkingly with really damaging results. Now, as I said, I share these two stories because I think they provide a very useful lens on the wider problems we face in foreign aid and international development and the kind of rethinking and the repositioning we need to undertake. So I've spent 15 years now working in international development and examining how international agencies work. And what I've found is international organizations and humanitarian organizations are shaped by and anchored in a number of mental, cultural, institutional models. What the anthropologist Mary Douglas famously summarized in her phrase, the thought world. And if I was to summarize this, it's that development agencies are incentivized to think and act as if the economy, natural resource systems, societies, the world as a whole, are analogous to a series of wind-up clocks or machines. Agencies act as if they can predict and precisely manage the behavior of these systems. And all you have to do is to break them down into smaller pieces and work on those pieces individually. They act as if all they have to do is design the intervention right from the outset and development will naturally happen. And this thought world underpins a huge amount of what the mainstream development system does, whether it's community development efforts, long-term statewide reconstruction efforts, disaster recovery, government reforms, public health campaigns, dare I say it, certain aspects of media development. And I think this is underpinned by a whole series of assumptions about what development is and what it does and how it works. There are assumptions about systems. about social and economic systems being closed, ordered, that we can reduce them to the bits that we're just interested in and ignore everything else. So we have organizations that just work on the health bit, the education bit, the media elements, and without really thinking about the interconnections between these systems. There's a real challenge around thinking about social relationships, that we tend to work as if we can deal with individuals, institutions, and entities effectively as independent and atomized. That the most important relationship is the one that we have with them, not the relationships they have with each other. We tend to think and operate as if humans are rational and they make decisions based on self-interest, and that you have this elaborate calculus that we're making all the time. And the only thing you need to do to change behavior is to change the inputs, the information, into this elaborate and invisible calculus. And we tend to assume that the world changes in linear, proportional, additive ways. It's a world of straight line graphs and lovely XY relationships. And Christoph mentioned the MDGs. If you look at some of the MDG anticipation curves from 2000, they were very much this kind of thinking. One of the questions I have is, have we really changed that within the SDGs? And I think that's one of the fundamental lessons. Now, where did these ideas come from? I think they had their origins in the classical physics of Isaac Newton. And they found their way into organizations in the 19th and 20th century through industry, through the ideal bureaucracies, through neoclassical economics. So these are the kinds of principles that Henry Ford used to deliver any color car as long as it's black. And so perhaps unsurprisingly, they're most useful, they're absolutely brilliant in situations where machines work well. So they come into their own where you have a straightforward task to perform, where you have a stable context and a stable operating environment, where you have identical, duplicable products, and compliant, predictable, reliable parts, including the human elements. Now, how many of us feel development replicates that picture? I think there's the challenge is those assumptions are not just wrong, they're profoundly damaging. They amount to a collective illusion that the mainstream development system demands is maintained, often in the face of all the evidence. Now, there's a American foreign policy analyst, Thomas Dichter. I don't always agree with him politically, but he had this to say about this illusion. We act as if development is something other than the complex and often opaque set of interactions we know it to be. We're all boxed into a collective illusion. Because of our urgency to end poverty, we act as if development is a construction, a matter of planning and engineering. And I would argue, and having gone through and looked at a lot of the failures of big aid over the years, and there have been many of them, from technology transfer to malaria campaigns to rural development to global education, that these assumptions underpin so many of those failures. Now, I'm not saying any of us believe this. I'm not saying any individuals believe it. I'm not saying any organization writes these into their organizational strategies. It's a bit more subtle than that. It's that these assumptions are hardwired into the way that development institutions work, how they're funded, how they report on what they do, and therefore they fundamentally shape how we work. I think people work in incredibly creative and innovative ways, but they do so despite the system rather than because of it. And I think the reason this is important is if we continue with our addiction to reductionism, if we continue with our prominence of this top-down linear approach, we risk learning the wrong lessons from our successes and not learning at all from our failures. And we risk not making enough of a difference to the people we hope we will help. I think it's worth asking, given that every generation of development critiques comes up with some version of this. So you can look at Albert Hirschman in the 1960s, Robert Chambers, who I now sit next to in IDS in the 1980s, Bill Easterly in the 2000s. Why does this cling on? Why does this model refuse to die? And I think in part it's because there's some development problems, you could argue is an increasingly small number in a globalized world, which are amenable to exactly this way of working, a top-down, neo-Fordist, Newtonian approach. But I would argue, and John Maynard Keynes famously quipped, that it is becoming increasingly apparent that it's better for individual and institutional reputation to fail conventionally than to succeed unconventionally. And I think this is really important. I think for development organizations, it's much easier for us to fail within the confines of this paradigm than to move beyond it. And as an aside, I think this week, as we see the SDGs being agreed, and they largely replicate the models and the assumptions of the MDGs, we're seeing the phenomenon of failing conventionally being the way forward writ large. So I think the obvious question is, how do we bring about more unconventional successes in development? So what I've found, and I'm not arguing that this is the only way to do it, it's just the way that I've found, and there are many, many different approaches out there. But these biases are neither inevitable or incurable. And there's growing numbers of experts that are pointing to the ideas of complex adaptive systems as an alternative model for thinking about and doing development. And what I found in my work, and which was summarized in my book, which was published a couple of years ago, and I've continued to work with some of the biggest agencies, including DFID and USAID, on bringing these ideas into the mainstream of their organizations, that these ideas can actually provide a basis for rethinking and reframing the way we do aid. Now, it's a popular notion at the moment, so I thought it'd be useful just to give you a little bit of an insight into where these ideas come from. What does complexity theory mean? Because a lot of you would just mean, well, does it mean the world is just complex? So I thought actually a little bit of history is quite useful. There was a man called Warren Weaver, and I tell his story in more detail in the book, but he was the chief scientist of the Rockefeller Foundation from 1928 to around 1950, so quite a long period. And he was a true polymath. He wrote one of the texts which underpinned the birth of computers, the theory of information with Claude Shannon. He funded a huge amount of work on cancer research. He helped set up agricultural development programs in the 1930s that actually put in place randomized controlled trials for the first time. He was decorated by 4 or 5 different countries as a result of his effort during the war. And he was sitting in New York in 1947 or 1948, essentially thinking, what kinds of problems should my foundation be funding? It's not a dissimilar question to what donors are trying to address right now. What should we be talking about? What kinds of problems should we be addressed? Are there any blind spots in what we're looking at? And what he talked about were there were 3 kinds of problems in the world. The first were problems of organized simplicity. And for going back a little bit, if you think back to being at high school, these are problems where you have 1 or 2 variables. You have straight line graphs, you have proportional relationships. These kinds of problems were the ones that we solved when we developed industrial machinery, transportation, the first wave of telecommunications, basic public health. So they achieved a lot. And I know for the Monty Python fans amongst you, and I think there are a few here in Germany, recounting this list of what organized simplicity solves always makes me think of the "What did the Romans ever do for us?" line in The Life of Brian. But what he argued was that science and policy essentially moved from dealing with problems of organized simplicity to disorganized complexity. So these were problems where you couldn't boil it down to 1 or 2 variables, but because you had so many variables going on, but the overall behavior was random. So you could take an average, and you could respond to those averages. So insurance, population movements, demographics, disease outbreaks, all use this kind of framing. If there are too many variables, we'll try and understand the average behavior, and that will help us understand things. What he identified was there were a whole cluster of problems between these 2 extremes, what he called problems of organized complexity. And he saw them as being poorly addressed by scientists and policymakers back in 1948, and I'd say they're still being poorly addressed. And these are complex problems that have an intricate kind of interconnectivity. There's a number of factors involved. It's not 1 or 2, it's not a million, but it's somewhere between 10 or 12 different factors. But they're really kind of intricately woven together, so you can't unthread them. The word complexity comes from the Latin complex, which means literally braided together. And he identified these problems as being ones where you can't boil them down to straight line graphs, you can't apply average behaviors. And then he started to look at what kinds of problems these were, and he identified that actually a huge number of problems came under this cluster. So understanding how an economy grows, understanding how cities change and develop, understanding how children learn, understanding mass social movements. There was a time when industrial action was a really big issue, and understanding those were really interesting, but they weren't simple problems, they weren't random problems, they were somewhere in between. And what he argued was that over the 50 years to come, all of the major problems mankind would face would be of this third kind. And he wrote this in 6 pages, and it was essentially the founding text of what we call complexity theory today. And many people would now argue that we actually live in a world that are dominated by such complex problems. So they're complex in that there are problems with many different interacting actors and agents, and organizations of agents. They're adaptive in that those agents have strategies which they iterate and they change over time. And they're systems in that macro behavior emerges from the interactions and the micro phenomena. So you can't simply reduce them down to like a car engine. You can't simply reduce them down just to the bits that you understand and work on those, because the overall system really matters. So let me give you some examples. Ecological systems are complex in exactly the way that Weaver described. And the costs of treating them as simple machines are actually increasingly all around us. The climate is clearly complex and nonlinear. The economy is complex, nationally and globally. Energy is complex, if you look at the European energy system, the North American system. Food systems, information systems, community, societies, media systems, I think they can all be formally described as complex systems. Now, this is a vast field of science with huge numbers of researchers working on it. But what I found is that if we want to bring them into understand social and economic, and if we want to understand human systems, there are 4 broad areas that are really useful. The first is to think about systems, that complexity science enables us to think in terms of systems that you don't reduce to a few variables. You take a more wide-angle lens and you understand that these systems are nested and they're interdependent, and you have to be able to understand those systems holistically. That networks really matter. You can't think about individuals and atoms, but these dynamic networks and the underlying structures of social relationships really are important for understanding development issues. This is actually a map that was developed. Unfortunately, the pointer isn't quite working, but this was a map developed by the CIA of Al-Qaeda circa 2005, 2006. Osama bin Laden is in the center there. And the analysis that undertook this said, even if you take out Osama bin Laden, which was a major issue, what you have is a fragmentation of Al-Qaeda into potentially much more extreme groups because of the hub and spoke model. And it's turned out to be quite a true prediction. It enables us to think much more about individual behavior and collective behavior, how what we do as individuals aggregates up to overall social movements. And it sheds light on real-world dynamics, which are non-linear. They're characterized by surprise and tipping points. They're not things you can easily get into a log frame. Now, these are all broad approaches for understanding and navigating complex systems. And I just want to give you a quick compare and contrast. So the reason why I'm drawn to these ideas and the reason why I wrote about these ideas is because I found them to offer a comprehensive alternative to the modus operandi of aid, these kind of top-down assumptions I talked about earlier. And that's where their value lies, that's where their potential lies. So I guess the question is, how can they be used in action? Are these not just theoretical ideas that can't actually be used in aid itself? And I would argue actually you can, and I've increasingly been working on this, and since I published the book I've been working with development organizations. I'm going to share a few examples. I've actually, in the book I look at 25 different case studies, and that body of work is increasing all the time, of aid interventions that have tried new ways of thinking and working, and they've led to dramatically improved results. Now, because of the time I've got available, I'm just going to share one short case study to illustrate this way of thinking that fits into the behavioral approach. Now, let me just quickly ask a show of hands. Who here owns a bicycle? Okay, keep your hands in the air if you think you could design a bicycle from scratch. Okay, you're all smart. The reason you can't design a bicycle from scratch is that even the humble bicycle was not designed in a top-down way. Even this most Newtonian of technologies came into being through a process of adaptive tinkering. And technology scientists are actually increasingly likening this to evolution. There's a process of variation, of selection, of amplification of successful approaches. And I think the reason I share this is that policies and practices and our organizations and institutions also come into being through this process of adaptation, learning, and adjustment. And I believe that our responses to complex challenges also need to be adaptive in their scope and delivery, less Newtonian, more Darwinian. Now, acknowledging and harnessing the adaptive power of poor people is something that we've long talked about. And it actually has underpinned one of the most important innovations in development in recent years, called positive deviance. Does anyone know of positive deviance? Have people heard of it? Okay, a couple. So I'll tell you the story of how it came about. So the first person to use this phrase was a nutritionist called Marion Zeitlin. And she came across this work in her phenomena in her work in the 1980s amongst children in America who were recovering from critical illnesses. What she found was positive deviance was an adaptive phenomenon. When she was looking at the recovery time, instead of seeing a normal distribution of recovery where you have children clustered around a kind of a medium, like height, if we were to take everyone's heights here, it would be like the left-hand chart here, or weights and so on. But what she found was the recovery rates were not distributed like that. They were like the chart on the right-hand side. And so you had some children that would recover incredibly well. They were complete outliers. And then there were large numbers of children that recovered not in a less effective fashion. And she identified this, it wasn't actually a biomedical phenomenon, it was about the social adaptations that the families, the parents, the wider network had made around that child that enable that child to recover more quickly. Now, positive deviance as a principle is all very well, but it was applied in the aid world in the 1990s because of two workers for the Save the Children Fund at the time, Jerry and Monique Sternin. And they found themselves working in rural Vietnam in 1990. And it was a time when Vietnam was still undergoing huge economic sanctions at the end of the war. I mean, it was only 16 years since the end of the war with America. And malnutrition rates were running at over 65% of all under fives. And there was an existing approach which was very much based on a top-down way of treating malnutrition, but it was unsustainable. People didn't like it because as soon as the resources were taken away, the children went back to being malnourished. And the Vietnamese government said, we're not going to let you do that, and we're not going to have and the Save the Children Fund said, well, if you're not going to do that, you're not going to have any money. So they had to come up with an alternative way of doing things with almost no resources, and they had to do it in a very short time frame. And so they essentially came across this idea of using the idea of positive deviance, that in every community, in every poor community, there will be families whose children are well nourished, even though they're poor, the equivalent of the outliers here. And what they did was they initially worked with 4 communities in a population of 2,000 children under the age of 3. And they invited the communities, they facilitated a process whereby the communities identified those families that were poor, but were able to avoid malnutrition against the odds, facing the same challenges and obstacles as everyone else, and without access to any special resources. Their basic starting point was a poor mother or a poor father whose child isn't malnourished can tell you much more about nutrition than a Harvard professor. So these were the positive deviants. These were the families that were doing things right. They were engaged in behaviours that most others weren't. And in the context of malnutrition, it was social, nutritional, and biomedical adaptations. And their genius was to respond to this, not by extracting the best practices and then redeploying them, but was enabling the community themselves to identify what they saw as appropriate, what they wanted to amplify. So it was an evolutionary process, not extract and redeliver, but facilitate and enable selection and amplification. Now, when I say evolutionary, some of you might start reaching from your history books and start talking about the issues of social Darwinism. Now, this isn't about the individual survival of the fittest. This is about building collective resilience by learning from the outliers within society. And so the process that they developed was based on this very simple process of variation, see the variation in the community, enable the community to select what they want to from that variation, and then amplify it. And in a sense, their grandmother's recipes in a very tangible form, a way of enabling these low-tech but profoundly important innovations to be shared by a community. And it enabled whole villages to rehabilitate their children with minimal outside intervention by tapping into their own adaptive capacities. So in the first 4 villages, it led to a reduction of 65% of the malnutrition cases, using only the resources the communities themselves had. And then the model was taken on by the Vietnamese government and they scaled it nationally. And over time, the positive deviance approach reached a population of 2.3 million children and was seen as making a major contribution to defeating malnutrition in that country. And since that time, it's been applied very widely. So it's been to all kinds of complex problems, to say the reintegration of child soldiers, reducing female genital mutilation in Egypt, enhancing sales tactics in investment banks. It's actually been used a lot in tackling hospital-borne infections in America, so MRSA and similar. All based on a very simple idea that you've got the lessons already there within a community and you need to apply evolutionary approaches to try and bring them out. And I'd argue that actually when you're looking at the Somali goat herders, it's exactly that kind of approach that will enable us to identify those positive deviants and bring those to the fore. And I think what's really interesting is Harvard Business Review identified this idea that came from a dusty village in rural Vietnam developed by two cash-strapped aid workers. They said this is one of the 10 ideas most likely to shape business in the next 10 years, they said in 2010, which I think is a remarkable transformation for an aid innovation. Now, the key to this approach is it was the opposite of the model that I was talking about earlier. It enabled the people involved challenge their assumptions about what they could do. They challenged assumptions around delivery. And they used new ideas to bust the assumptions and come up with an alternative way of doing things. So within the international development sphere, we've got a whole range of different assumptions, and the top row here identifies the conventional assumptions. And I think the value of complex systems thinking is it gives us an alternative framing. I'm not saying it's the only way to bust the assumptions. You can look at anthropology, you can look at participatory methods, you can look at behavioral economics. But the value of complex systems thinking is one of the few that enables us to bust all of these assumptions simultaneously. And I'm not arguing, by the way, that we should say everything is complex. The key is taking a more scientific approach to how we approach development. So that if we're like a physicist and we're dealing with temperature, we're not going and trying to measure temperature with a ruler. We're using the right tools for the right kinds of approaches and the right methods. And so when we are facing simple problems, we deal with those using our existing modus operandi. But when we're dealing with issues like media development, which could be seen as much more complex, much more on the kind of right-hand side of the spectrum, we use appropriate approaches. Now, there is a growing community in development that believe that these ideas are absolutely central to rethinking aid. If we're going to be a more relevant, appropriate way of doing international cooperation in the 21st century, these ideas are going to play a really central part. And I'm heartened by the fact that actually a number of donors are engaging with these ideas, a number of operational organizations are engaging with these ideas. They're trying to put in place exactly these kinds of changes. And I think the challenge is to apply positive deviance to the sector itself, to find the places where people are doing things differently in creative ways despite the pressures of the sector, and try and amplify those and learn from those. And through that, bring about a wholesale change in the way that we operate. And I believe that that's important because I think if we cannot change the way that we operate ourselves, then we can't ever possibly hope to ask poor people in developing countries to change what they do. We have to look to ourselves first. So in wrapping up, let me briefly return to this and share some reflections for what I hope from a media for development perspective. So I hope they'll be relevant. But I want us to imagine that we're the mHealth providers that were banned in that 3-month period that the Ugandan government banned all of these applications. And therefore had to come up with a different way, a little bit like the Sternins in Vietnam, had to come up with a different way of doing things, a different way of working, a different way of operating, because we couldn't just carry on with our usual delivery. What kind of mindset shift would we have needed to undertake? I think there's 4 key shifts that are necessary. I think the first is we need to move away from this narrow reductionist focus on just the things we can control to a much wider angle approach, looking at the contextual factors, feedbacks, and interactions. To understand social systems as ecosystems, not as machines. And I'm heartened when I look at the media for development work, and there's increasingly this work on media ecosystems and social ecosystems, which is bubbling up, and I think that should be really encouraged as a positive deviant within the system. I think we need to think much less about strategies for delivering best practices which get quickly outmoded and should probably be extinct, and think much more about strategies that help us maintain the best fit with the changing context within which we are working. And I think this is also happening with media for development in the shift away from just delivery of training to try and understand how do you make sustainable change. It's about engaging with institutions, it's about engaging with behaviours, and I think that's something that really needs to be encouraged. I think we need to work in much less top-down ways much less Encyclopedia Britannica, much more Wikipedia. So less extract, organize, and deliver, much more curate and steward. So it's less about and enabling others to create the content that they want to, and providing platforms which they can use and adapt as they go. So to essentially be much more open source in our approach. And I think that is also happening in many areas of media for development. And I think most importantly, we'd need to give up being the controllers and architects of change and be the navigators and facilitators. We have to appreciate that change is unpredictable. It has ebbs and flows, has surprises and tipping points. So we have to be less like Zeus commanding on high and more like Odysseus charting a course between order and chaos. I think perhaps most importantly of all, I think we need to take on board this wonderful quote from Albert Einstein. We can't solve problems until we change the way of thinking that we used when we created them. It's a very final point I want to leave you with today, and it's the most important message, and I think it's one I'd love you to carry on in your discussions and your debates over the course of the next 2 days. Thank you all for listening. I hope that's been provocative and generated some useful ideas, and look forward to